So thank you for joining us, and thank you for the piece that you wrote on supplier evaluation. What next? So what do you think you mean by that?
Well, good morning, Keith. Yeah, great question. And what we're talking about here is COVID has affected many things, and many articles start with the talking about COVID. Well, the impact here is the supplier evaluation or supplier due diligence process has been found wanting as a result of COVID. And what we're talking there is historically, suppliers were asked about their safety issues, their financial issues, and ultimately price. What we're actually finding now is clients need to look at the risk in a more holistic fashion and look at the multidisciplinary issues around that supplier, because every time they come onto site, they import a level of risk. What we're talking about here is we need to undertake evaluation of those different risks and categorize them accordingly based around their materials and their demographics and their work activity.
So how, you say that all suppliers are importing risk, then how are you seeing that manifesting itself in the real world?
Yeah, well, one of the things that we have to look at here is that clients tend to look at things in a one-size-fits-all when they're doing supplier due diligence, which doesn't really work. Because if you've got a company who's coming on site just simply emptying bins or watering plants, the risk is fairly low. But if you look at a supplier that's doing high-risk activity, we need to look at how we can address that in a more substantial and incremental manner. And by that, what I mean is it has to be measured, and we have to look at the risk that they're bringing in and how we can address that and how that will impact on their ultimate delivery of the project. Okay,
so how much of a problem is it then that, you say some buyers have applied contractual mandates to act as a resilience catch-all?
Yeah, what we're seeing is a lot of companies have issued severe contracts with, which is pretty standard practice, but the reality is that in many cases, they're using that as their risk assessment as part of the due diligence. And we've seen recently in Vietnam, where many fashion companies in the West are now starting to beat their supplier down because they've not delivered to a certain timeline. But bearing in mind that the governments in those countries completely stopped every single type of factory production going. So we need to be fair in how we look at this, and the contractual mandate should just be part of the supplier due diligence. We also need to look at things such as business continuity. That is something that we're now being asked to look at in terms of the supplier due diligence process. And by that, this is not just a case of honesty box, do you have one? Yes, let's go on to the next question. Let's interrogate that. So if we have a situation where a factory can't produce or there's an incident at the factory, they can outsource that production somewhere else, so still meeting the contractual mandate. So that issue there, and this is something that we're seeing, is that companies are simply using that and that in its isolation.
Makes sense, yeah. I mean, we've seen in the last kind of 18 months or so where support's been high, we're seeing Avetta clients receiving greater buy-in from key suppliers. So, would you say that key supplier registration then is getting easier for clients?
What we're actually seeing here is that the clients who are actually doing the virtual hand-holding and giving greater levels of support, we're seeing lots of different pressures being put on suppliers, whether that be safety requirements. ESG is the most current one, is that suppliers need to understand what a client's expectations are. And the only way they can do that is by the client communicating that in a consistent and simplistic way so everybody understands, especially when they're dealing with the smaller, the small, medium enterprise, the SME businesses. If they've got CSR initiatives and they're working with local companies, the micro businesses, they need to explain what's required and then give the support. This can also include things such as preferred tender bids with additional requirements around supplier benefits, things like that that actually make it easier for the supplier to work with you, but also help educate them. This is not giving things away, but this is just making the whole process a better process, because the client needs to understand what's happening in the lower tiers as well. And the only way they're going to do that is by having better relationships with the tier 1 supplier, because very often the lower tiers have no contractual relationship or loyalty to the client who's actually utilizing that product in the end.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. And you concluded then in your report that ultimately understanding your supplier's BCP should be a critical component of the due diligence process at pre-requisition stage. So any parting thoughts for us, around that?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we're finding is that simply just asking, does someone have a business continuity plan pre-contract award is certainly not sufficient. COVID has shown us that. The automotive industry in the United Kingdom and in other parts of mainland Europe literally come to a standstill within 6 weeks because they've not actually done any proper due diligence on those tests. So what we're saying is include it in the pre-contract award, but also look at it post-contract after they've completed the work to understand what kind of processes the company has in place. So if further contracts are awarded, the whole due diligence process becomes far more robust because you're simply looking at far more things than safety, environmental, and other things like that.
Great. Well, appreciate your insights there, Mike. Thank you very much for your time.